All right, we are ready to get started. It is my great pleasure to introduce Hannah Birgé. I met Hannah, she asked me to serve on her PhD committee at University of Nebraska, and I was kind of out of the blue, and I was like, yeah, sure, great. And we've had a lasting friendship ever since, and have published a paper and a book chapter together. So Hannah got her bachelor's from St. Olaf College in 2009, her master's at Colorado State University, and then went on to do her PhD at University of Nebraska, Natural Resources and Applied Ecology. And then she graduated in 2017. This was a really interesting aspect of your CV, was that you were a postdoc, adjunct faculty, and became the director of agriculture for TNC in Nebraska in 1 year, 2017. And then most recently, she became senior agricultural scientist for the Nature Conservancy, I should say. She has a really nice set of publications on a really broad range of topics, including soil organic matter dynamics, some diseases in mammals, right? But her main focus is on socio-ecological resilience, adaptive management of ecosystem services, and the adaptive capacity of ecosystems. She is the lead PI on several major awards, millions and millions of dollars of awards from foundations, industries, and federal agencies. And currently she is governor appointed on the Nebraska-Kansas Blue River Compact. So she really bridges the worlds of terrestrial and freshwater ecosystem ecology. And she's going to be very brave today. She chose to give a presentation with no props. So this is Nature Conservancy style.
In fact, it's not. If this was Nature Conservancy style, you'd have like Comic Sans font like crammed onto a slide.
Hey.
The wingdings. Heidi says, hey, not totally. Oh, thank you, first of all, Sarah, for that amazing introduction.
Maybe just the back. The back.
We're figuring out lighting for those on Zoom. You're good. Yeah, that was such a kind introduction, and is just really strange to hear coming out of someone else's mouth. I cleaned up dog vomit off my kitchen floor this morning, so definitely staying grounded despite it all. But yeah, it's super nice to be here. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me, and just for all the faces in the audience. I did choose to go without slides. I started making slides today, but realized they didn't add too much to the talk. So apologies to the visual learners. At the end of it, you can beat me up if I didn't do a good job. Toward trying to paint a picture with words, but I just figured that might be an easier way to do it today. And super excited to hear questions at the end of it. If you have a burning question, something I missed in between, raise your hand and interrupt me. I really do hope this is a little bit more of a discussion. And I don't have a really long talk, and so I'm hoping we leave time at the end to sort of have a more fruitful back and forth discussion. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm a senior scientist with the Nature Conservancy, and I work primarily with big food and beverage agricultural corporations. I like to call my role as one of translation. So I translate best available science, strategy, policy to companies so that they can embed nature outcomes in their supply chain strategies. And when we have big companies moving the needle even a little bit, the idea is that we can have really major impacts on the things we care about for people and nature. So that's the short version, and the long version of what I do is going to be really the rest of this talk. And I like to start, especially with more academic groups, by describing the lens I use, which is called the complex adaptive systems lens. This is a framework that most are probably familiar to you, even if the name is not, because its core tenets really come from things like ecology and other complex systems. So if you're an ecologist, when I describe a complex adaptive system, you're going to say, I know what that is. It has multiple sort of features, but I'm going to focus on 3 today. So 3 features of complex adaptive systems that I really like and resonate with me. The first is emergence, and that is the overall system behavior is not necessarily explainable by the individual actions of the actors that are part of the system. I'm going to get into a little bit more of what this means later. The second is recurrence. Another word for this that you all probably use are feedbacks. So there are feedbacks within the system, an individual's interaction with another individual actor will eventually recur back to it, whether directly or indirectly. It can be a positive or negative feedback, but that kind of recurrence or feedbacks are really classic descriptions of complex adaptive systems. And then the final one, and this is what really separates the group of systems that we all are familiar with from classic sort of physical systems like turbulence. And this is called adaptation or learning. So these systems evolve over time in response to external and internal stimuli. And complex adaptive systems persist because they can learn. And so there are some great examples from neuroscience, for instance, where our brains see a positive potential stimuli. Parts of our brain send a little package of information to one part. The brain says, yes, that was actually good, and sends dopamine back. And so incentive structures are really important when we're trying to think about how systems learn and grow. The systems that can learn and respond to those incentives are the ones that persist. And so even though it can feel normative, like the system is learning, we know the system, with the exception of human cognition, isn't an actual person, it's not animate. It's really just more of a feature of the types of systems, that do persist. So yeah,
sorry, there were just some Zoomy people. Yes, exactly. That's all.
Sorry, everybody. I've been giving lots of talks to my computer in the last few years, and sometimes talks in person. This is the first time I've done both. So I'm not, thank you. Keep calling me out if I drift. So complex adaptive systems have a lot of examples. There are some prototypical ones. I'm sure folks are already starting to think about some in their lives. I'll list a couple. Ant colonies are a prototypical complex adaptive system. Some people would argue our economy. So the global economy is a complex adaptive system, neural networks in the mind, and of course, ecosystems. And that's really where I stumbled upon this idea. It's a way to conceptualize ecosystems. Now, a lot of people, including some in the room, sometimes say that this concept is a little bit too vague to be really relevant when it comes to testing scientific hypotheses, and that's correct. Complex adaptive systems is not a theory, it's not a testable hypothesis. It's just a lens to help our very narrow, sort of imperfect human minds try to understand often immeasurable and irreducible complexity around us. So I just want to be clear, this isn't an academic or scientific theory that you'd go out and test. And in fact, there's still quite a bit of debate. You find people who call themselves experts in chaos theory or chaos and complexity or complexity science. And especially in physics, you see a lot of pushback against that because it isn't testable. And so from that perspective, it is science in some ways, but it's not science in others. So I want to also make that distinction, especially because Sara Baer is in the room. So I like to start, and I'm not saying that Sarah is against complexity. I just remember she schooled me pretty majorly during my PhD on this. So it's helped me evolve my thinking. So I like starting with this definition of complex adaptive systems because it can actually help us conceptualize modern agricultural supply chains, both the good and the very bad. And I think most folks here are familiar with the very bad, but also the opportunities to try to adjust and manage those systems so that we can have better outcomes for people and nature. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about sort of the recent history of our modern agricultural supply chains. I'm going to start in the middle of about the 20th century with the onset of the Green Revolution. Most folks in the room know of the Green Revolution. Okay, you get more at a land-grant institution, I was just wondering. The Green Revolution was really about sort of three major leap forwards in technology that supported one another and transformed the world as we know it. Mostly seed breeding technologies, input, including irrigation, fertilizer, pesticide technologies, and huge steps forward in equipment. To give you an idea of the impact of the Green Revolution, between 900 CE and 1900 CE, the average wheat yield went from about 0.5 to 2 metric tons per hectare. So 0.5 to 2 in 1,000 years. In 50 years of the Green Revolution, yields went from 2 to 6 metric tons per hectare. So complete orders of magnitude, huge amounts of increase in yields. In Asian countries, particularly, so we're talking China, Southeast Asia, and India, real per capita income doubled in 50 years between 1970 and 2000. And poverty declined nearly 60%, or from 60%, excuse me, to 30%. So roughly halving of poverty. This was at the time where you had huge population explosion. So not only do we have massive population growth during this time, we also had an enormous decrease in the amount of people living in poverty and the amount of people facing hunger. There's one estimate, and I had this in the description of my talk, that the Green Revolution saved 1 billion people from starvation. It's very hard to actually measure these things. So we like to use the term 1 billion. It's really impressive. We don't know if that's actually true, but it gives you a sense of the amount of people that were saved from abject poverty. Bringing it to the US, I think this is really interesting, especially we're all in Kansas. At the beginning of the turn of the century, half of the US workforce was employed in agriculture. So raise your hand if you're from Kansas. So half of you probably would not have gone to university at the turn of the century, right? You'd be working on the family farm. So I just think it's fascinating. And we still see, I did my PhD in Nebraska and have family there, and you still meet a lot of people, oh, my grandparents' farm, my great uncle's farm. You're seeing fewer and fewer people saying my parents' farm or my farm. And I think that's sort of reflected everywhere. Right now, it's the US workforce lives in farms is just 0.7%. So we went from half the US population to 0.7 in about 100 years. To give you a sense of sort of the larger implications for demographics and economics, between 1945 and 2000, so basically the end of the World War to 2000, so really peak Green Revolution time, the share of US agricultural GDP went from 7%. So if you look at all the revenues from agriculture, it made up 7% of the US GDP. At the end of the 20th century, 0.7. So a huge decline. And part of that was driven by the fact that farms were getting bigger and we were shifting heavily towards using mechanical equipment versus human power to manage those farms. We also saw not only sort of a rush from from rural areas to urban centers because of this, there was also policy in place. The federal government passed laws that said you could take out loans to buy equipment, not to hire people, not to pay people. So some of this was driven with feedbacks from the agricultural revolution. Some of it was actually mandated in policy. And if you drive through rural Kansas and rural Nebraska and other places in the Midwest US, you can see these small towns are still shrinking, right? The heyday of like sort of the 1950s and 60s is over. So it's also fascinating to know that that shift was partly responsible for the manufacturing boom in the United States. And so the Green Revolution, it's hard to understate the impacts it had globally and including in the United States. There are also some really strange and controversial estimates that our ability to grow more food, fuel, and fiber on fewer acres or the same amount of acres prevented about 30 million hectares from being converted between 1965 and 2004. And most of these would be marginal lands in developing and developed countries, so really widespread. Now, the Green Revolution defied in many ways an idea that most ecologists are familiar with, which is carrying capacity. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich is a famous demographer, and he predicted the population bomb. Have folks heard of this before? He basically made the argument that humans are rapidly driving towards a cliff, and that once we hit the edge of our ecosystem, of our natural limits, we're going to go over a cliff and there's going to be massive starvation, massive upheaval. And at the time, this was incredibly well received. Folks thought that he understood what was going on. He knew that humans are not sort of somehow able to rise above the laws that dictate all other sort of natural populations. Then he took it a step further and he said, if we're going to address this, there are two things that we should do. First, the United States should cut off food aid immediately, because no amount of food aid that we could give India is going to save tens of millions or even 100 million people from starving to death. The second was a mass sterilization program that he said the United States could design and the Indian government could implement. Now, in retrospect, this should horrify us, and it does. And not only is it morally abhorrent, but he was completely wrong. Between the time that his book was published and the end of the 20th century, India not only did not face a massive famine, they actually became a net food exporter. And we see these lessons all over the world. And so really the question is, are we able to somehow green revolutionize ourselves out of sort of these systems that say we have natural carrying capacities, or are we just prolonging it? And I think it's really interesting when you think about all of the other countries in the world that have been grappling with this dynamic. And if we've consistently seen, especially over the last 30 years, a real decrease in famines. Now, that could potentially end with the war in Ukraine, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I just really want to emphasize that for a long time, there was this predominant thought, especially in sort of the ecology, environmental science corners of the world, that said, we're going to at some point hit our limits and we're not going to be able to feed people. And we've actually seen humans sort of surpass all of those. Now, we still have a lot of doom naysayers saying that like at some point we are still going to hit those limits. But it's important to note that we haven't not hit them yet that we can tell. Now, that's not to say the Green Revolution didn't have a lot of disastrous impacts, because it did. Nor has the Green Revolution sort of stopped our ability to expand into new lands. The same inputs like pesticides, fertilizers, irrigation that boost yields, and especially agrochemicals, poison our freshwater systems and warm our climate. That's unequivocal. I think most folks in the room are very aware of the ecological consequences of industrial agriculture, but I'm going to go through them quickly anyway. Right now, agricultural residue burning in Southeast Asia is making the air so unbreathable that it's attributable to 100,000 direct additional deaths in the last year alone. Agriculture is responsible for about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, slightly smaller in the United States, but globally, 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the agriculture and land sector. It's responsible for 70 to 90% of global agricultural withdrawals, water withdrawals, excuse me, mostly for irrigation. And many of these areas are happening in places where the withdrawals are non-renewable. Nearly 40% of European inland water bodies are considered impacted. That's a legal definition, impacted by agriculture. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, driven by agricultural runoff, was larger than Rhode Island and Connecticut combined in 2022. As worrying, and especially for an NGO like the Nature Conservancy, we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. We are in the midst of a mass extinction crisis. And most of that is attributable to direct conversion of land for agricultural production, along with all the indirect inputs like poisoned water and climate change. In Kansas, 24% of private wells and 28% of farmstead wells test above the EPA nitrate threshold of 10 parts per million. In Nebraska, where I completed my PhD, elevated nitrates in rural drinking water supplies are increasingly being linked to an explosion of pediatric cancer rates. I have family in rural Nebraska, and they've stopped drinking the water and their neighbors haven't. And they've seen children of all ages, an explosion of leukemia and other types of soft tissue cancers. Now, whether that's directly attributable to nitrate levels is still up for debate, but there's some really compelling evidence coming out of University of Nebraska Medical College that in fact, there's a very strong link. So it's not good, right? We have a lot of really great outcomes from the Green Revolution, and we have a lot of really unacceptable side effects. I'm going to bring this back around to the definition of complex adaptive systems, because it's a really helpful model for understanding both the benefits and the downsides of supply chains. And it's also a very helpful model for the groups that we work with. So in my role, I work with folks across the supply chain, from input providing companies to farmers, to folks who are buying commodities from farmers, processing them, consumer packaged good companies, all the way to the grocery store. And you have to try to find ways to create models that are inspiring, that folks can connect to, are easily understandable, and also create places where you can actually inject change. So again, I'm going to bring it back to this definition of a complex adaptive system, and I'm going to describe those three characteristics in a little bit more detail now that we've all sort of had a journey through the Green Revolution. So the first is emergence of properties. And for supply chains, there's interactions among vast, multiple, diverse actors across the supply chain, from farmers to grocery stores. And an emergent property of all those interactions is staggering efficiency. We, in our Western modern societies, pay less for food as a share of our budget than any other humans in history, and far more than folks in developing countries. So it's incredibly amazing how much efficiency has emerged from this system. It's also incredibly brittle, which I will talk about in a moment. Supply chains also give rise, or also have recurrence, and so these are the feedbacks. One great example is the ongoing expansion of US farms. So if you think about a typical Kansas row crop farm, farms are really big, and farmers are managing them with fewer and fewer people. Margins for grain prices are getting smaller and smaller. And so the response from farmers to all of these conditions is to try to get more equipment, get into more debt. And then in order to pay that debt, they have to get bigger and bigger and expand into more ground, usually renting ground. You find very few farmers who are getting smaller and staying in business, with the exception of some sort of small grains, organic farmers. But generally, those feedbacks are creating larger and larger farms. A less academic way of saying this, farmers will tell you, get big or get out. Finally, supply chains are adaptive and they learn, especially in response to incentives. In our current supply chain, there has been one dominant incentive, and that is efficiency, market efficiency, and cost efficiency. So right now we see supply chains that are incredibly efficient, as I mentioned earlier, but we also see them able to respond to those efficiency and price incentives. So things like consumer demand for more fresh goods, consumer demand for organic, we actually see this really big, really entrenched, really complicated and complex supply chain adjusting fairly quickly. Organic grain makes up roughly 1% of all the grain grown, which sounds small, but it's amazing how fast organic has sort of triggered this expansion, and that 1% of all of our corn right now in the country and all of our grains are grown organically. So that's a really good example of new sort of external stimuli coming into the system, but using existing processes and existing feedbacks. One thing that the supply chain does not have and does not know how to value is transparency. And this is really important. So because we don't have a really great way to put a price on transparency, and because transparency was never an incentive, there is none in the system. It's a feature of it. It was not intentional, but it's something that has made traceability really challenging. One of my favorite examples, and this could be a completely made up anecdote, but I use it a lot, so apologies to General Mills in advance. The CEO of General Mills apparently was up in his tower office, and he saw a bunch of protesters out his window in the early 2000s with signs that said, "Cheerios kill chimpanzees." And so he called his team together and they were like, what could possibly be an ingredient in Cheerios that kills chimpanzees if humans are eating them? And so they spent a few weeks investigating every single ingredient in Cheerios, trying to understand what could possibly be poisoning chimpanzees. Well, what was actually happening is that palm oil was a key ingredient in Cheerios, and palm oil demand driving deforestation was destroying chimpanzee habitat. And so once they realized this was the issue, the CEO, like many big food and beverage company CEOs, said, okay, well, let's fix it. And it sounds simple, and there is the will to do it, but how do you actually solve a problem like this? If you think about corn, I'll go back to corn grain or wheat. Let's go with wheat because we're in Kansas. There are hundreds of wheat farmers supplying their grains to a single elevator. That elevator could be owned by a co-op who then manages the grain and ships it to a company. That company could take the grain, process it. Another company could turn it into bread or cereal products, the raw ingredients, and then it goes on the shelf in Walmart. A company like Walmart or General Mills does not have visibility down to the farm. They could not tell you a list of farmers. They could not tell you who the farmers are, necessarily exactly where they're located and what practices they're using. Wheat that goes into their supply chain could be grown using the best available practices, could be using quote unquote regenerative practices that give back to the soil, or they could be on farms that recently tilled under native prairie and shouldn't be farmed. And there's no way for most companies to know that. So there's been a huge revolution in the past 20 years to try to create supply chain transparency where there wasn't, with the eventual hope that once we understand where things are coming from, we can start building incentives into the supply chain to ensure that where we're sourcing our raw goods for the agricultural supply chain are contributing to more good for people and nature than they're contributing bad. So I think it's also, I'm going to quickly bring up a few like modern events that are, I think, top of mind for many folks working in agriculture to talk about how brittle supply chains are. So they're very efficient from a market standpoint. They're not transparent and they're incredibly brittle. And one reason for that is that supply chains and and really because we're living in a system of capitalism have become very tight. And what I mean by that is there's no slack in the system. We have very few sort of warehouses where we're storing large amount of products. The federal government in the United States and across the world try to counteract that somewhat by having sort of these strategic stores, but for the most part, there's just not a lot of slack. And so we saw with the supply chain, we saw with the pandemic, parts of the supply chain completely shut down. And some really strange things happened. So we saw meat prices in grocery stores skyrocket, and we saw farmer payments for meat go down, and we saw farmers unable to move their animals. My father-in-law operates a cow-calf operation in central Nebraska, and he had multiple animals that by the end of the summer, he thought he might actually have to slaughter himself and just leave the carcasses because he had no one who would take them. And the folks who were taking them were often doing it at bottom barrel prices because they didn't have anywhere to send the meat. So when you start having these supply chain breakdowns happen and there's no slack in the system, you have less food on the shelves and you have more food stuck in the field and you have farmers getting paid less for a product. And we are seeing that happen with supply chains globally, but in agriculture, I think it's been really obvious and clear, and it's made the headlines. I also want to quickly call out the war in Ukraine. So the potential grain embargo seems like it has been broken up and overcome, but overall, Ukraine is a major breadbasket, especially for the Eastern Hemisphere. And there's a lot of concern among a lot of food experts that Ukraine's inability to sort of grow crops at the rate that they were is going to slow exports, and we could see potential food insecurity, especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa that only recently in past decades have really started to overcome food insecurity. I am in my mid-30s, and so I remember growing up reading and hearing about sub-Saharan Africa and Saharan Africa food shortages and mass starvation events. I think the younger folks in the audience didn't grow up with famines as front and center. I hope that's not the case, but it just goes to show that these supply chains, because they're so fragile and they really can't absorb this sort of stress, we might end up seeing more food shortages, especially from the war in Ukraine, of course, exacerbated by other threats like climate change. So given all of this complexity, given the challenges of the supply chain, how do we actually proceed? And the answer is that it's very slow. We proceed slowly and carefully. A lot of our work thinks about trying to embed different ideas and practices throughout supply chains, knowing that at some point there could be massive, what we call windows of opportunity, where things change really quickly. So one example could be, like right now, farmers are able to kind of get away with using practices that rely on heavy tillage. We could see with extreme drought conditions over more than 4 or 5 years, farmers realizing that they have to stop tilling and that there's really no option. And if we don't have any farmers who know how to do that and tell their neighbors, we're not going to be able to use that window of opportunity to have massive uptake and adapt. So a lot of our work is really happening incrementally. I like to call it the possible adjacent. We say what's possible and let's take one step outside of it. So even though it's a really exciting space to be in, and the downsides are things that we really have to address immediately, it is slow going. So I'm going to talk about, I like to say that first, so that then when you hear about the work that I'm actually doing, you're not like, wow, that's really boring compared to all of this really cool stuff you just did. So my team right now at the Nature Conservancy, we do a lot of work with food and beverage companies, and it really falls into 2 buckets. The first is that we do really in-depth analyses of companies' supply chains. And the second is we provide actionable, on-the-ground, durable strategies that we expect our partner companies, when they're working with us, to adapt and to pay for and to get going on the ground. So I'm going to give a couple examples so that you understand what this means. So the first, we work with a very large global food company. They're consumer facing and they sell a lot of coffee. They like to add a lot of milk to their coffee. And right now they're not sure what the water risk associated with the dairy production of that milk is. So they know that dairy is a huge water user. Beyond that, they're starting to try to understand where are the risks, how can we address them, and what are the things we can be doing now. So for this company in particular, they've given us some proprietary data that we're not allowed to share that shows their sourcing locations across the US and Canada. So basically, where are their major sourcing points in space and what volume do they get? And we have years in volume. And for the most part in these supply chains, it's very stable. So if you're getting 100 million gallons of milk from one sourcing spot in 2021, you'll probably be getting something similar or a little higher in 2022. And we take that spatial data and we overlay it with things like publicly available data from USDA. So we look at dairy cow demographic or dairy cow census data. We'll use publicly available water data like from a place called Aqueduct. And what we do is we overlay all of this and we say, we're looking at the places where you're sourcing and we're looking at your sourcing trends if they're increasing over time. And here is the local water risk that you're facing. Here's the water quantity risk and the water quality risk. We also map on governance features. So in most of the Eastern United States versus Western United States, there are very different ways of governing water. And so we integrate that as well. So the company can look at their sourcing location and have a really strong idea of, we are in a place where water is depleted. We're in a place where probably our sourcing is contributing to water quality problems. What should we actually do? And so the next step is, here are the actions you need to take on the farm and at the watershed scale. And this is where sometimes it can be really cool and sometimes it's really just nitty gritty. So in a lot of cases for dairy conservation, especially, it's going onto the farm and making sure that the equipment's not dripping, right? Like, do you have leaky faucets? Because that's a huge source of water waste. We also make recommendations for things like oxbow restorations. Like if we know that wetlands and other natural landscape features can help with water quality amelioration in some regions, we make those recommendations as well. It's really important that when we're working with companies as a nonprofit that we make sure that we don't stop at the recommendations. So if we work with a company who keeps coming back to us and saying, hey, help us do the analysis, and then 2 years later, hey, help us do another analysis, at some point we say, no, it's time to act before we'll work with you again. So some of it is a give and take on that front. Another company, and I can list them publicly, where we've been able to sort of do both pieces is McDonald's. So McDonald's came to us and they said, we know that our hamburgers have high greenhouse gas intensity associated with them. How do we actually deal with this? Where are the emissions coming from? So we worked with them in a group out of University of Minnesota to map emissions throughout their supply chain. And one thing that lit up in that analysis was grain production in Nebraska. So grain, very specific, grain grown in Nebraska that goes into the beef supply chain as feed is associated with enormous greenhouse gas footprint. Unfortunately, there's a lot of opportunity to mitigate that. So that work led right into a larger project with Target, Cargill, and McDonald's, along with NRCS. And this is about a $9 million project. We're also partnering with about 50 farmers in Nebraska to adopt soil health practices, cover crops, no-till, and diverse rotations. The objective of that project is not to necessarily deliver carbon credits or benefits to the company, it's to innovate. Do these practices actually work? Is this actually going to be reducing those emissions that we know are a huge source of your supply chain? And the answer so far is we don't know. We're in year 2, but we have had huge farmer demand. We have about 30 farmers and a little over 30,000 new acres enrolled in the program. So that's an example of going from both a recommendation to let's actually get some work done on the ground. These are just a few of many examples of how we work with companies. And I want to be really clear that like these projects are tiny, tiny little specks. If you look at the grand scheme of agriculture and these supply chains, these projects can almost get lost, right? They're not going to make a huge change in the business case of these companies. However, getting back to my point a few minutes ago about those windows of opportunity, these companies now know how to have a conversation about their supply chains. They know how to interact with farmers. They know how to measure and track their outcomes. And so when there is potential policy, if there are major environmental sort of shifts or biophysical shifts, companies have some of the raw tools they need to start reacting and responding. One example I'll use that was incredibly helpful for our work was the proposal for the Security and Exchange Commission. I know it sounds very random. The companies start reporting and disclosing their emissions. And so this means that if a company is going to be publicly traded in the United States, they have to give tons of information to the federal government about how they do business, but now they also have to disclose their emissions. And they also need to disclose whether or not they're making progress towards emissions targets. And when you have sort of that top-down policy, that sort of stick at the top, and then you have groups like us working with companies and where the carrot at the bottom, we can really start seeing movement in the system. So I'm getting to my final point, I promise. I do want to touch on something called greenwashing that I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with. It's the idea that companies do very little or nothing, make claims that they have green supply chains because who actually knows what green means, and they move on with their lives. We won't work with companies like that, obviously. It's very hard to figure out who's greenwashing or not. But we have a really rigorous legal team. And if there's any evidence, we just don't work with them. What we do work with are companies that like to call green wishers. So they're not green washers, but they're green wishers. They do a few things. They make some changes in the right direction. And they feel like, you know what, we've some signals down the supply chain that this matters to us. And we've done our job. And now it's time for everybody else to do theirs. And those are the companies that we really have to get on board. We have to drag behind us because what we need is collective action. Climate change is such a huge problem. Water quality and water scarcity issues, biodiversity crisis. These aren't things that we're going to be able to figure out piecemeal. Like we need the entire supply chain moving together. So a lot of our work is, again, trying to use complexity language, language about systems change to get everybody on board and moving in the same direction. And then I'm going to finally leave you with a quote from one of my favorite collaborators at a big food and beverage company. She said, "I know we want to do better, but we don't know where to start. And just saying we need to transform our supply chain is getting more meaningless by the day. I need small actionable steps that ladder up to change. When I can do that, I can create the buy-in among my colleagues who actually have power in R&D, sales, and the executive teams, basically the decision makers. Otherwise, all this energy about sustainability amounts to nothing. So that's really what we're trying to do, is make sure that all of the energy amounts to something. So that is the end of my prepared talk. I want to thank Sara again for inviting me, and for Kirsten for organizing. I'm really excited to dive in and answer any questions you all have.
Harry?
Hannah, you see these companies taking on and bringing into their own house and their own companies people who understand these systems like you do?
Wait, you might want to reiterate the question for Zoom.
Oh,
sorry.
Yep.
I always forget.
Do we see companies hiring folks internally to do some of this work for them? Is that, yeah, the gist of it? Yes and no. You see folks doing that, or you see companies starting to hire corporate sustainability personnel, but usually they're quite isolated within the companies and they need to be able to leverage themselves externally. And so we find a lot of like simpatico people who are working within the companies who are a lot like us at the Nature Conservancy. We try to like leverage them higher up in the company, because otherwise they sort of get stuck on an island. But when you have a third party sort of knocking on leadership's door, it can make a big difference. So it is happening, and there's like a huge corporate sustainability hiring boom right now. But it still seems like that hasn't solved the problem, unfortunately. Yeah.
So do you see a lot of companies coming to you like on their own accord, or are there incentives for them to come to you and make a change?
The incentive, so do we see companies coming to us and like what drives them coming to us, and is there incentive to change? Is that okay? Yeah. The incentives are a lot of like consumer pressure, like you all folks like voting with your dollars at the grocery store, like that stuff makes a huge difference. And companies know that millennials and Gen Z especially are like, we're not going to buy your products if we think you're evil. So like that is a huge incentive. There's also activists that are on boards of publicly traded companies, activist shareholders who will, get in the boardroom and say like, if you don't clean up your act, then, like we're going to dismantle this company. And a lot of other companies I don't know if the word clout is right, but they want to show their competitors in the supply chain. They also want to show their customers that they are trying to do good. So there's a lot of soft pressure. As a nonprofit, we actually can't necessarily work with a company who comes to us and says like, do this for us. Like they have to come to us and say, like, here's what we want to do. And if it aligns with our mission and what we're interested in, we think they're moving in the right direction, then we'll choose to work with them. So we have to be very careful about not like, yes, we'll work with any company who comes our way, right? And we actually, in fact, do turn companies down quite a bit. Yeah.
So if you're talking about working with supply chains and farmers, is that just in the US, or do you work internationally? And if you work internationally, are you taking into account also like human rights issues and things like that?
So most of our work as a US-based nonprofit is in the US, but we have rapidly growing programs all over the world. India, China, and Latin America, specifically Brazil and Argentina, are places where we have a lot of agricultural work. And we have an entire framework, especially for places where there is contention over land rights and indigenous rights holders and other stakeholders. We have a lot of frameworks, and that's an area in which we would usually say no to a company. Like if they come in and we know that they've been involved in human rights violations, or there's indigenous claims to the land that they're violating, it's an immediate non-starter for us. So yeah, it's super important. It's a lot trickier, honestly, in the US, because a lot of our land, like the land rights really aren't sort of set in stone, right? And there are a lot of indigenous people who have a very clear right to the land and do not occupy the land. And so that becomes a lot more complicated for us. We want to be able to get the practices on the ground that are clean up our air and water, but we also don't want to necessarily be contributing to a problem where like disenfranchisement of people who should be on the land is happening. So it's something that we're grappling with a lot, and it's a really important question. I don't have a better answer for you right now.
Many years ago, I heard a talk on social networks and agriculture, and the idea that a few farmers might be the innovators, et cetera. So you probably know way more than I do about it. Is that part of your mission to try to move that forward at the agricultural level?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the question was, you have some like movers and shakers at the bleeding edge of the curve with farmers, and like, can that create some social contagion? So we actually like don't work with the cutting edge farmers because they don't need us. But what we try to do is like give them a bigger platform, invite them, like pay them to come give talks, to talk to other farmers, pay them to do demo days for us. We try to work with the middle of the road farmers, like the typical, like, yeah, the standard farmers. But you're absolutely right. The social contagion is a huge driver in how we shift things.
So I'm really curious about like palm oil specifically, because I know I've heard a lot of different issues associated with that, and sometimes I see like sustainable palm oil labels and then with washing or something. So I'm curious, like if a company is asking you about palm oil, if you're more likely to kind of point them to like sustainable palm oil or to something like an alternative to palm oil, especially since I know it's not really farmed in the US.
It's a great question. So the question's about palm oil and how we deal with that commodity specifically with companies. We don't ever like point a company like you should like source from this company specifically, but we will say like, here are the hotspots that you should be avoiding. And if you're actively sourcing from a region where we know there's massive deforestation occurring, like that's an area where we could say like, you need to stop sourcing from that region, right? So the palm oil one is really tricky. Soy in the Amazon is another really tough one for us because soy farming is driving massive amounts of conversion in the Amazon, the Cerrado. So that's another area where, you know, we will not work with a company and take money from them if they're involved. We will sometimes provide pro bono, consulting to them. So if you're a company that is a bad actor in this space, we're not going to take your money, right? We're not going to work with you. We're not going to let you publicly say you're working with us, but we are going to start giving you advice, because if no one's working with those bad actors, they're going to keep being bad actors. And so we want to make sure that we're being practical, but that we're not taking money, because then stuff starts getting a little bit murky, both, you know, in appearance and in actuality, I would say. Yeah, good question.
There was one on the chat, but I have one as well.
Okay. Okay, let's do B. Welsh. The McDonald's example ignores the elephant in the room, namely beef production significant methane problem. Does Nature Conservancy advocate for emissions in beef production to lessen climate impact? Yes, absolutely. When we're talking about emissions, we want to move to a whole system reduction in emissions. Methane and nitrous oxide are two major agricultural greenhouse gases. For that project in particular, we are focused on carbon sequestration in croplands, not sort of like the cow methane emissions directly. But we are working on another project. It's called Feed in Focus, to try to see if various food additives can mitigate cattle methane emissions. That's another example of a project where it's like the gains appear very marginal, but like we need to start testing some of these ideas out. I also just want to emphasize that like we're never going to get perfect, especially with like heavy reliance on animal agriculture. There are a lot of people who would argue that the only way to solve this is to move away from animal agriculture, but that is maybe an ideal that some people have, and like we try to work in the present. So we know that like for now, animal agriculture isn't going away. How can we make it better? And we face a lot of criticism for sort of taking that practical middle road, but I think the criticism is really fair and it keeps us honest. So keep it coming if you have it. Yeah.
Can you talk about your relationship to ESG, like environmental, sustainability, social, and governance funds, and how you see their role in the system that you described?
Yeah, so the question was about ESG funds. And so we're actually working with a subsidiary of a major like retirement fund right now. I'm really new to this space, so I'm gonna have to speak in generalities, but basically, you know, these large investment firms will buy they'll invest in startup companies that potentially have like social good or environmental, social, or good governance outcomes. Some companies own massive amounts of land, and like the land asset is actually sort of like a huge part of their portfolio. And that's usually the type of company that we'll work with is the one that has large land assets. And so, for example, the way we're working with this particular company is to say, you know, like, if you have this land, how is it being managed, right? Like the same way we work with corporations, you know, are you contributing to these unwanted outcomes? What are practical things you can do on the ground? With the addition of a much heavier, actually, indigenous clause. So this company in particular owns a lot of land in South America. And so making sure that human rights is actually authentically and durably included in the metrics they're using to report on their funds is really important, because it's really easy for a company to say, like, we have this ESG fund, aren't we great? And everyone moves on. But we need to make sure that if folks dig and even, you know, groups like the SEC, like, ask for more data, that we actually have something to back it up. And again, this would be an example of us serving in a more consulting role, but we would never have like our logo or our names publicly associated like with this type of fund, because that would potentially show, give them private benefit or show that like they're more credible than maybe we feel like they're ready for. And so we provide consulting services, but we stop there, if that makes sense. Hi, Terry.
Yeah, I'm interested in the characteristics of the people that you work with at Nature Conservancy. So, first of all, what are the skills that you have to have? And what's the educational background that you look for when you're hiring folks?
Wow. So the question, Heidi, if you want to put anything in the chat, please go ahead. It was, what kind of qualities and characteristics do we look for in people at the Nature Conservancy, and what kind of background, education, et cetera?
Yeah, and can you name like specific skills that you look for in people? Yeah,
so, well, the first one that I really like is my boss's boss was like, we don't hire, well, I'll just say the word jerk. We don't hire jerks at the Nature Conservancy anymore. And if you are a jerk, you're going to get marginalized. We don't care how successful you are, how much money you bring in, like, you're not welcome here. So that's actually really nice. I don't work with anyone who's mean, which is, I know sounds really silly, but it's really great. I'd say folks who are successful are really good communicators. They can write really short emails, something I'm working on. They can set really good, like, don't set up useless meetings. I mean, just kind of the same stuff that would make you successful, I think, in business or academia, really good soft skills. And then we absolutely need systems thinkers who can transcend multiple domains, but have specific expertise. So like, if you have a background in like wetland biogeochemistry, but you also know how to translate that and you could talk to a policymaker, like, that's the kind of stuff that we love to see. And I don't think we would expect someone like right out of grad school to have those skills yet. So someone out of grad school who is still like very like domain centric is okay, as long as they're willing to be coached. Heidi, Mel is on here as well, and she and I both have PhDs and work for TNC and live in Kansas. But I think we're more the exception than the rule. Like, master's level scientists tend to be really successful. And I would say we even have some like folks with bachelor's degrees who have been at TNC so long, they'll have a scientist title. So yeah, PhDs are definitely not needed. They can be helpful.
It sounds like a lot of people use GIS.
Oh yeah.
Are there specific GIS jocks, as you will, or do you all have to learn some GIS? Oh no, no. I have two people on my team who have GIS skills. One of them, like, her title is spatial scientist, and she has a master's degree. And she also has a lot of cartography skills. So someone who can like pretty garbage data from a company, you know, like pretty messy, like not a lot of metadata, and like somehow turn it into something interpretable, and then combine it with other publicly available layers and turn it into a beautiful map, right? Like, very basic skills with like a really good cartography is something that I think is we're always hiring for. But I don't have those skills. I don't know if Heidi does. It's not something that is like required by any means, thank goodness. Yeah. Don't be a jerk.
Don't be yeah. You're not welcome.
A lot of nonprofits. I know you all seem to be great consumers of science, and I'm curious if you could comment. Are there any opportunities? I don't see a lot of direct, research related, components to a lot of work. It's very much hands-on and much more trusting the BMP best management process. Do you see any places where PNC could best perhaps facilitate research or help support it?
Absolutely. So the question is, like, how can TNC facilitate research? Because we are, as you said, we're more consumers of science, and we are producers, with some exceptions, excuse me. I think we probably have about 100 PhD level scientists who seem like academics to me at TNC, where they are like publishing science, and that's their whole job. And most of them have university like joint appointments. But for most of us, it really tends to be ad hoc. Like, if we find someone that we like working with who has the skills, like, we'll grab onto them. At University of Nebraska, our program has like funded like PhD students or master's students, or like a month of faculty's time to like do work for us. I would love to see it get more formal than that. Like I'd love to start bridging gaps with KU and KSU. I mean, you all are in my backyard, because we absolutely need the people who are doing the science, because as you said, like we're consuming it and we're translating it, and that means that we fall behind really quickly on knowing sort of the best available science. I hope I answered your question. I don't know if I did. Okay.
I mean, just to rip up what Jude's saying, how many times when you're looking for a map, you're trying to make a map or whatever, do you run into, well, we have to get the data from all these places and it's hard to get it, but we can get it, versus saying, well, that data doesn't even exist?
Ooh, I mean, we probably think the data doesn't exist a lot, and it does. Yeah. No, we have a ton of blind spots for sure. Yeah. And my team, I have a mix of masters and PhDs on my team, which can be really helpful. But I know there is also a lot of like sadness among the PhDs on my team. Like this is the downside of being a PhD at a nonprofit, is that like our charge is not to be publishing. So like if you come across like a really great idea in the literature, it's like if you have time on the side to pursue that, you can. But for the most part, like we have deadlines and deliverables, and we can't sort of pursue our own research agendas.
Oh, Heidi had some comments.
Oh, good. Thanks, Heidi.
Does everyone know Heidi? You want to introduce Heidi?
Heidi, can you come off, or can you show your face? Maybe not. There's Heidi.
No, I don't know if you want to see my face right now. I'm in work from home.
I'm sorry.
Full work from home mode right now. But hi everyone.
She's the director of water and agriculture for the Kansas chapter of the Nature Conservancy. So she got her master's and PhD from K-State. Actually lives here in Lawrence. So she actually is one of the folks that is a little bit more like science proper. She's a hydrogeomorphologist or something. So if you want to grab something, honestly, she's brilliant. If you want to grab coffee or lunch with her, I will give you her email. She's great, and she's here in town.
Thanks. I think a lot of people there probably do know me. And I actually did my master's at KU, and Kelly Kincher, who I see on the call, was on my master's committee. So
you guys
have some connections.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So maybe a lot of you actually do know her.
We're coming out of DC with USDA and BIL, or any, you mentioned these companies work like the Canada, like the large one we have here in Canada. Are there any measurable outcomes that they're going to work on? Like, I don't know if they're necessarily goals they're trying to meet, but are, they're going to support these practices, just like the carbon market thing that's ramping up, and nobody has a clue how to really measure it well. So are any of the groups who are working with these new larger consortiums, are they compelled to measure and see if they're making any impact?
Yeah, and when you say GM, you mean General Mills?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's asking about a General Mills carbon project in Kansas with farmers and how people are tracking and measuring and monitoring. Is that okay? So this is one of the trickier parts, because a lot of the academic literature that's measuring changes in soil carbon over time, like comes up with an experimental design with the right number of samples, right? And it's not to say that like finances are not an issue, but you usually have enough budget to do the work that you say you're going to do. And a lot of these projects are trying to measure soil carbon change over time using like one sample per 30 acres, right? It doesn't work. And so there's right now, I think a lot of the energy in the space is trying to figure out how to make it work. And right now, I think there's a lot of energy around, let's continue building like a library of empirical data that we're using to initialize these process-based models like Descent or DNDC, so that we can eventually start getting like really good estimates of soil carbon. But the confidence intervals or the prediction intervals around those outcomes are like incredibly wide. And we do have some places where it could work, like where we have a lot of land grant institutions, but right now it's like still a pipe dream. And there are people working on it from lots of different fronts, but I would say that's probably one. I'm not sure that we're going to crack that nut anytime soon, and we need to. It's a good question. Yeah.
That's Jude Castens. He runs the remote sensing program.
Awesome.
I was talking about cards earlier when we were having it. It's relevant. Okay. Anything else? Great, Hannah. Thank you so much. If we don't have any more questions, appreciate it.
Thank you all so much.